The name Poe brings to mind image of murders and madmen, premature brutals, and mysterious women who return from the dead. His works have been in print since 1872 and include such written classics as The Telltale Heart and The Raven. He is widely acknowledged as the inventor of modern detective story. Poe's reputation today rests primarily on his tales of terror as well as the haunting lyric poetry. Just as the bizarre characteristic in Poe's stories have captured the public imagination, so too has Poe himself. He is seen as a morbid, mysterious figure lurking in the shadows of the moonlit cemeteries or crumbling castles. This is the Poe of legend. But much of what we know about Poe is wrong, the product of the biography written by one of his enemies in an attempt to defame the author's name. The real Poe was born in Boston on January 19th, 1809. Edgar was the second of 3 children. Within 3 years of Poe's birth, both his parents had died, and John and Frances Allen took him in with Poe's siblings went to live with other families. Mr. Allen would raise Poe to be a businessman, but Poe had dreams of being a writer, in emulation of his childhood hero, the British poet Lord Byron. Early poetic verses found written in young Poe's handwriting on the back of Allen's ledger sheets reveal how little interest Poe had in the tobacco business. By the age of 13, Poe had compiled enough poetry to publish a book, but his headmaster advised Allen against allowing this. Poe returned to Richmond and visited his home of the fiancée Elmira Royster, only to discover that she had become engaged to another man in Poe's absence. Poe accomplished the first objective by publishing his first book, Talmoraine, when he was only 18, and to achieve the second goal, he enlisted in the United States Army. 2 years later, he heard that Frances Allen was dying of tuberculosis and wanted to see him before she died. By the time Poe returned to Richmond, she had already been buried. Poe and Allen briefly reconciled, and Allen helped Poe gain an appointment to the United States Military Academy in West Point. Before going to West Point, Poe published another volume of poetry. While there at West Point, Poe was offered to hear that Allen had remarried without telling him or even inviting him to the ceremony. Poe wrote to Allen detailing all of the wrongs Allen had committed against him and threatened to get himself expelled from the academy. After only 8 months at West Point, Poe was thrown out, but he soon published yet another book. Broke and alone, Poe turned to Baltimore, his late father's home, and called upon relatives in the city. Poe's Aunt Maria Clem became a new mother to him and welcomed him into her home. Clem's daughter Virginia soon became the object of his desire. While Poe was in Baltimore, Allen died, leaving Poe out of his will. By then, Poe was living in poverty by the Saturday Visitor. Poe was living in poverty, but he had started publishing his short stories, one of which won a contest sponsored by the Saturday Visitor. The connections Poe established through the contests allowed him to publish more stories and to eventually gain the editorial position at Southern Library Messenger in Richmond. It was at this magazine that Poe finally found his life's work as a magazine writer. Within a year, Poe helped make Messenger the most popular magazine in the South, with his central stories as well as scattering book reviews. Poe soon developed a reputation as fearless critic who not only attacked an author's work, but also insulted the author in the Northern Library establishment. Poe targeted some of the most famous writers in the country, one of his victims, the anthologist and editor Rufus Griswold. At the age of 27, Poe brought Maria and Virginia Clem to Richmond and married Virginia, who was not yet 14. The marriage proved a happy one, and the family said to have enjoyed singing together at night. Dissatisfied with his low pay and lack of editorial control in the Messenger, Poe moved to New York City. In the wake of financial crisis known as the Panic of 1837, Poe struggled to find magazine work and wrote his only novel, the narrative author Gordon Pym. After a year in New York, Poe moved to Philadelphia in 1838 and wrote for a number of different magazines. In spite of his growing fame, Poe was still barely able to make a living. For the publication of his first book of short stories, Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, he was only paid 25 free copies of his book. He soon became a champion of the case of higher wages for the writers as well as an internal copyright law. To change the face of the magazine industry, he proposed starting his own journal, but he failed to find the necessary funding. In the face of poverty, Poe was still able to find his solace at home with his wife and mother-in-law, but tragedy struck in 1842 when Poe's wife contracted tuberculosis, the same disease that had already claimed Poe's mother, brother, and foster mother. The January 1845 publication of Raven made Poe a household name. He was now famous enough to draw large crowds to his lectures, and he was beginning to demand better pay for his work. He published 2 books that year, The Failure of His Venture, His Wife's Deteriorating Health, and rumors spreading about Poe's relationship with a married woman drove him out of New York City in 1846. At this time, he moved to a tiny cottage in the country. It was there, in the winter of 1847, that Virginia died at the age of 24. Poe was devastated and was unable to write for months. His critics assumed he would soon be dead, and they were right. Poe only lived another 2 years and spent much of that time traveling from one city to the next giving lectures. He was found in a bar room of a public house that was being used as a polling place for election. The magazine editor, Joseph Snodgrass, sent Poe to Washington College Hospital, where Poe spent the last days of his life far from home and surrounded by strangers. Neither Poe's mother-in-law nor his fiancée knew what had become of him until they read about it in the newspapers. Poe died on October 7th, 1849, at the age of 40. The exact cause of Poe's death remained a mystery.